The owner said, $50, take it or leave it. The man sitting across the counter didn't argue. He just picked the guitar up very slowly, settled it across his knee the way people settle things they have held 10,000 times before, and began to play. By the third bar, the owner's pen had stopped moving. By the sixth, his mouth was open. By the end, there were 4 other customers in the shop, and none of them were looking at anything except the man on the stool who had just been offered $50 for the instrument in his hands. The pawn shop was called Hartley's, and it sat on a narrow street in Notting Hill, London, in the kind of building that had been a shop of one kind or another for 100 years, and looked it. The windows were dusty in the particular way of shops that deal in second-hand things, not neglect exactly, but a kind of accumulated history that cleaning would only partially address. Inside, the walls were hung with guitars, brass instruments, old radios, camera equipment, and the various objects that people bring in when they need money quickly and are prepared to accept considerably less than the things are worth in exchange for getting it immediately. The owner's name was Raymond Hartley. He had inherited the shop from his father in 1971 and had been running it for 18 years by the time the quiet man walked in off the street on a Thursday afternoon in October 1989. Raymond was 53 years old and had spent those 18 years developing the particular skills that pawn shop ownership requires: the ability to assess the value of almost anything quickly and accurately, the patience to deal with people who were often in difficult circumstances, and the practiced detachment that prevented him from becoming emotionally involved in the stories behind the objects people brought through his door. He was good at his job. He was especially good at guitars. He had handled hundreds of them over 18 years. He knew the difference between a genuinely valuable instrument and one that merely looked impressive. He knew how to spot a quality repair and how to identify damage that had been concealed. He knew the major manufacturers, the significant models, the years that mattered. When a guitar came across his counter, he could give it a reliable assessment in under a minute and be confident in the number. The guitar the quiet man brought in was a battered acoustic. It had clearly been played extensively. The body showed the particular wear pattern of an instrument that has spent years in close contact with a player's body. The fretboard was darkened with use, and there were small dings and scratches that told the story of a life spent being carried from place to place and played in various conditions. It was not, by Raymond's immediate assessment, a particularly valuable instrument. The make was not one of the premium names. The condition was well used rather than well maintained in any collector's sense. He wrote $50 on the assessment slip and slid it across the counter. The man looked at it. He was unremarkable in appearance. Medium height, quietly dressed, the kind of face that did not immediately announce itself. He had come in without drawing attention to himself, waited his turn with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting, and placed the guitar on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a person handling something they were not entirely sure they wanted to part with. He looked at the slip for a moment. Then he said, "Would you mind if I played it one last time before I decided?" Raymond shrugged. This was not unusual. People often wanted a final moment with the things they were bringing in. A last look, a last touch, the brief ceremony of goodbye that made the transaction feel less abrupt. He gestured toward the stool at the side of the counter that he kept there for exactly this purpose. The man sat down. He settled the guitar across his knee. He adjusted his position slightly, finding the particular angle that suited him. And then he began to play. Raymond was writing something in his ledger when the first notes came. He continued writing for 2 bars, his pen moving in the practiced shorthand of 18 years of inventory management. By the 3rd bar, the pen had slowed. By the 4th, it had stopped entirely, though Raymond had not consciously decided to stop writing. His hand had simply ceased to move because some more fundamental part of his attention had been commandeered by something it was not prepared to ignore. He looked up. The man on the stool had his eyes closed. His left hand moved along the fretboard with a fluency that Raymond, who had handled hundreds of guitars and listened to hundreds of people play them, had never encountered at close range before. It was not merely technical, though the technical facility was immediately and obviously extraordinary. It was something underneath the technique, something that the playing contained and expressed that Raymond did not have precise language for, but recognized with complete certainty as different in kind from anything he had heard in 18 years behind this counter. By the 6th bar, Raymond's mouth was open. He was not aware of this. He became aware of it a few moments later when one of his regular customers, a man named Gerald who came in every few weeks to browse the camera equipment, touched his arm and said quietly that he might want to close it. Raymond closed his mouth. He did not look at Gerald. He could not look away from the man on the stool. At some point, Raymond could not afterward accurately say when, the other customers in the shop had stopped what they were doing. There were 4 of them: Gerald with the cameras, a young woman who had been looking at a tray of rings near the window, an older man examining a set of binoculars, and a teenager who had come in to inquire about a trumpet. All 4 of them had, without communicating with each other, arrived at the same decision: to stop what they were doing and listen. The shop had gone quiet in a way that Notting Hill shops on Thursday afternoons in October did not go quiet. The street noise continued outside, a bus passing, a dog, the distant sound of someone's radio, but inside Hartley's pawn shop the only sound was the guitar. The man played for 7 minutes. Raymond counted them afterward, approximately, working backward from when the playing stopped to when he remembered last looking at the clock. 7 minutes. In 7 minutes, the man on the stool had played something that moved through several distinct phases, a slow opening that established something Raymond could only describe as a mood, a middle section that built on it with increasing complexity and emotional weight, and a final passage that brought everything back to the simplest possible expression of whatever the playing had been about, and then stopped. The silence after it was the loudest silence Raymond had heard in 18 years of running the shop. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then the young woman near the window made a sound that was not quite a word. Gerald exhaled. The teenager with the trumpet inquiry simply stared. The man on the stool opened his eyes. He looked at Raymond. Raymond said, and he said it before he had thought about whether to say it, in the way that true things sometimes come out before the filter of professional composure has time to engage. "Who are you?" The man looked at him for a moment. Then he told him. Raymond Hartley sat down on the stool behind his own counter. He sat down because his legs had made a decision independent of his conscious instruction, which was that standing was no longer necessary or advisable. He sat and looked at the man across from him, who was still holding the guitar, still sitting on the customer stool, still entirely unremarkable in appearance, and he understood with the full retroactive force of 7 minutes of music what he had written on the assessment slip. $50. He had written $50 on an assessment slip and slid it across the counter to Eric Clapton. He said, eventually, "I think I made an error in my assessment." Clapton looked at the slip, which was still lying on the counter between them. He looked at it with an expression that contained, in roughly equal parts, amusement and something gentler, the expression of a man who is not interested in making another person feel worse than they already do, and who understands that the assessment was made in good faith with the information available. He said, "You assessed what you saw. That's your job." He placed the guitar back on the counter carefully, the way he had placed it there the first time. He said that he had changed his mind about selling it. Raymond said that he entirely understood. There was a brief pause in which both men occupied the same space of mutual recognition, Raymond of what had just happened, Clapton of what Raymond was experiencing. And then Clapton picked up the guitar, said that it had been a pleasure, and walked back out onto the street in Notting Hill and disappeared into the Thursday afternoon. Raymond sat behind his counter for a while after the door closed. Gerald, who had remained in the shop throughout and who had recognized Clapton approximately halfway through the 7 minutes of playing, said nothing for a respectful interval and then said, "I could have told you." Raymond said, "You could have told me sooner." Gerald said, "I thought you knew." Raymond did not know. He had assessed the guitar with 18 years of expertise and arrived at $50, and the number had been correct for the guitar considered as an object and completely, almost cosmically wrong for the guitar considered as what it actually was, an instrument in the hands of the person who would go on to be recognized as one of the greatest guitarists in the history of popular music, who had walked into a pawn shop in Notting Hill on a Thursday afternoon and sat on a customer stool and played for 7 minutes because he had been asked if he would mind. He had not minded. Raymond Hartley kept the assessment slip. He kept it in the drawer behind the counter for the rest of the time he ran the shop, and when he retired in 2003, he took it with him, and it sits now in a frame in the hallway of his house. $50, written in his own handwriting, the most inaccurate assessment of his career. The number that preceded 7 minutes of music that he has spent the years since trying to describe accurately to people who were not there. He has never quite managed it. The closest he has come is this. He says that in 18 years of handling other people's things, he learned to see objects for what they were worth, and that on one Thursday afternoon in October 1989, a quiet man sat on his customer's stool and showed him, in 7 minutes, that he had been looking at the wrong thing entirely. The assessment slip in the frame in Raymond's hallway has become a shorthand for a lesson that resists being stated directly. Visitors ask about it, the framed piece of paper with a number on it. He tells them the story. At the end, most say some version of the same thing, that they would have made the same assessment. That without hearing the playing, the guitar was just a guitar. Raymond always agrees. He says yes, he had done exactly what his training told him to do. That is precisely the point. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that some things can only be understood by listening. Because the training, 18 years of it, carefully accumulated, genuinely useful, had taught him to see the object, the condition, the make, the fretwear, the market value of comparable instruments in comparable condition. These were real things, and the assessment was accurate for what it measured. What the training had not taught him, and what 7 minutes on a Thursday afternoon had shown him with a clarity that no amount of subsequent reflection has diminished, was that the object and the instrument were not the same thing. The object was worth $50. The instrument, the same physical item, in the same condition, on the same counter, in the same shop, was worth something that did not fit in the assessment slip's number field. Not because it was rare or collectible or associated with a famous name, though all of those things were true, but because of what happened when the person who understood it most completely picked it up and played it. Because of what moved through the wood and the strings and the air of a Notting Hill pawnshop on a Thursday afternoon and made 4 strangers stop what they were doing and stand in silence and listen. That is what Raymond had written $50 next to. That is the assessment he keeps framed in his hallway. Not as a record of a mistake. He is careful to say it was not a mistake given the information available, but as a reminder of the distance between what you can see and what is actually there, between the object on the counter and the music waiting inside it, patient and invisible for the right hands. Clapton walked back out into the Thursday afternoon and did not sell the guitar. He carried it back to wherever it had come from and continued the relationship with it that the 7 minutes in Hartley's had briefly made visible to a handful of strangers. Raymond went back to his ledger. Gerald went back to the camera equipment. The young woman bought a ring. The teenager asked about the trumpet. The shop returned to being a shop, but Raymond kept the slip. And when people ask him what the most valuable thing he ever had across his counter was, he does not name an object. He describes a Thursday afternoon in October and a man on a stool and 7 minutes of playing that made him understand for the first time in 18 years that he had been in the wrong business. Not the pawn business, the seeing business, the business of looking at things and deciding what they were worth. He had been very good at it. And on one Thursday afternoon, a quiet man had sat down on his customer stool and shown him, without a word of instruction, that there was a category of worth his 18 years had not yet taught him to measure. He has not forgotten it. He does not expect to. Some lessons arrive in the form of a number written on a slip of paper, and they stay exactly where they land. There is one detail Raymond mentions when he tells the longer version. When Clapton had finished playing and Raymond had asked who he was and been told, in that moment, before either of them said anything else, Clapton looked at the guitar still across his knee and smiled. Not at Raymond, not at the absurdity of the $50 slip. He looked at the guitar and smiled the way people smile at things they love, privately, without performance, before the face has decided whether smiling is appropriate. As if the 7 minutes had given the guitar something back. Raymond understood in that moment what he had not understood before. The guitar had not been brought in to be sold. It had been brought in to be played. In a room of strangers who had no idea who was playing it, and that had been enough. He knows it now. He has known it for 35 years, in the way you know things taught not by instruction, but by witness, by being present when something true happened and having the sense to stop writing in your ledger and listen. Some assessments cannot be made in 30 seconds. Some things require 7 minutes before you understand what you are looking at. And some of the most valuable things that ever rested on Raymond Hartley's counter left exactly as they arrived, unassessed, unpriced, and entirely themselves.